Hey everybody, this is the Long Range Addicts podcast. I'm your host Cole Kornberg. Thank you for joining us. If you're downloading on the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, all the rest of them, thank you for the downloads. We really appreciate it. Tonight we've got a really good guest for you. A lot of you are going to have questions about this, I'm sure. So make sure if you've got questions, ask. We'll try and push them over. We've got a lot of stuff to cover, but we'll try and get it going. We're going to do a couple things tonight that I don't necessarily always do. All three of us are Army. I kind of wanted to give a little, thank you to Sergeant First Class Gutierrez and Rodriguez. If you guys and gals don't know who they are, they just gave their lives for us. We appreciate them. We're Army. We appreciate everything. We appreciate our brothers and sisters that, do the ultimate. So I wanted to make sure that I shouted that out to them. I want to make a shout out real quick to Benchmark Barrels. Benchmark Barrels came on. We're a brand new podcast. They believed in us. They're like, hey, how can we support you? I appreciate Bill and Courtney up there. They've done amazing things for myself, Team POI, and everybody else that's involved. I can't say enough about them. If you guys are looking for a new barrel, check there. They do awesome work. They even do, they build guns. They do brakes. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't even know about. Check them out, benchmarkbarrels.com. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest host tonight, JD. JD, we met at the USASOC Sniper Comp last year. We talked about precision shooting, got to know each other. He'd been in the U.S. Army 14 years and has dedicated the last 11 of the years to the study application of long-range shooting. Thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me, Cole.
Not a problem. And the man of the hour that we've all come to talk to, Mr. Emil Praslick. How you doing, Emil?
I'm good, Cole. Thank you.
Good. So Emil he was a former coach at AMU. If anybody knows who that is, Army Marksmanship Unit, one of the elite units. The United States military, they go out there, they shoot. That's what they do. They're freaking good at what they do. They set world records. And I'm excited to talk to him about some of this. I've sat through some of his briefings at some of the matches and different things that I've gone to, and I'm kind of excited to ask him my own questions. But Emil's in charge now of business development, military, and tactical sales at Capstone. They run Lapua, Burger, different companies like that. Do you want to kind of introduce us a little deeper, Emil, and we'll go from there?
Sure. So I retired from the Army back in 2015, where I was the head coach at the Army Marksmanship Unit for the service rifle team. That's the team that did long-range shooting and shooting with kind of accurized M16s. We kind of focused on position shooting, sort of traditional NRA, some people call golf course type shooting. So it was my job to kind of train, select, and mentor those shooters. As part of that job, I got to spend a lot of time with guys like JD and his peers in the military community, training guys on long range shooting and marksmanship, especially within the sniper community. After I retired, I took a job with Burger Bullets, which became Capstone Precision, and now I do business development, military projects, military contracts for Burger Bullets, Lapua cases and cartridges, Vitavori powder, and SK rimfire. So I'm kind of right back in the same world that I have always been in, a lot of the same guys. So it's a great job for me, and I get to go out and do some competition stuff like King of 2 Miles and some other long range stuff, and get to keep my fingers in the shooting world.
Yeah, and that's fun. I mean, that's the thing is, I got out 2009, and it seems like now I work more with a lot of, the guys that go out there and shoot more and do different things like that. So it's kind of been fun for me to kind of dip myself back into it a different route like you have. But I kind of wanted to bring you on. A lot of everybody knows you as the wind master. You go through and you teach people how to read wind, and wind is honestly probably one of the biggest factors that people do. They spend hours and hours and hours of reloading bench, right? But
Yeah.
yeah,
Wind is the single largest reason that people miss targets, period. Brian Litz calls wind a non-deterministic factor. And non-deterministic means that it does not occur with certitude. I had to look that up. So that means that you don't know that the shit's going to happen when it's going to happen. So and if you look at any sort of statistical analysis of shooting, the sort of WEZ or weapons employment zone analysis or statistical analysis, wind is the number one way to get better at upping your hit percentage. Kind of learning to read the wind and get into what we call like elite level wind reading. And I could talk a little bit more about that if we start talking about processes, but I mean, that's the best way to hit targets is to learn how to read the wind.
yeah, for sure. You got anything on that, JD?
It definitely is. One of the things we try to keep in context with the newer shooters we get on the committee and really in the schoolhouse is just how much of what Emil just said is true. A lot of them see it as an overwhelmingly daunting task, and really, if you focus on a few basics, it becomes much less daunting. It's always going to be an issue, but if you stick to a tried and true method, wind suddenly becomes far less scary, if you will, and much more, I guess, forgiving, depending on how you apply your shooting with it.
Yeah, it's about a process, like JD says. The first thing is, the story that I like to tell is, when I first got on the Army team back in the mid '90s, we were at a match, this long range match, 1,000 yards, shooting with an M14, and the wind was blowing its ass off. It was blowing so hard that we had to actually aim at the target next to the target we were shooting at, because on the old M14s, they ran out of the left and right windage at about 8 or 9 minutes of angle of wind. So, I mean, the wind was blowing like 15, 20 miles an hour. And I asked this old timer, I'm like, hey man, how much wind is out there? And he looks down there and he's like, I don't know, that's about 14 minutes. I'm like, well, how do you know that? He goes, well, it just is. I'm like, well, okay, well, tell me how to do that. He's like, man, you got to do that for like 20 years to learn that shit. And I was like, man, I don't have 20 years. I'm like, bro, I got to figure this out like now. So I started trying to figure out like what's the process of like putting a number on it. And I think as long as you kind of look at it as in that context, a lot of people get intimidated and are daunted by the task of like reading the wind, because everybody tells them it's hard. Everybody tells them, oh, it's secret trick. And well, that guy knows it because he's been doing it for 40 years. And that's really not true. We used to take guys that just got to the marksmanship unit, and within maybe one season, they were already outperforming people that have been doing it for over a decade, just because they're using best practices. And in JD's case, he's got a matter of weeks to get guys competent. And I've seen the training and it works. You just have to look at, first of all, what are my expectations? How far is the target? How big is the target? First things first, which way is the wind blowing? Out of the left or out of the right? Sometimes that's the metric of success. You shoot in some of these mountainous terrain where the wind is whipping around, and just getting if it's left or right-handed wind is good enough. Then after that is how far away is the target and what can I get away with? One thing that I really preach is make it the easiest you can on yourself. Like, hey, for example, with a 175 grain out of a 20-inch or so semi-automatic 308, if the wind is blowing under 4 miles per hour, you can hold on the left edge or the right edge of a full-size IPSC and get a hit. You'll get a hit on the edge, into the middle, or on the downwind edge. So do you have to take out your Kestrel and perform all kinds of complicated tasks? No. Know what you can get away with. And that changes by caliber and bullet and target size and all that. So first things first is you teach a guy up your hit percentage at all ranges. And then with all of the the things in reticles, and probably JD can talk better about this than I can, but all the reticles with wind dots or time of flight dots or whatever it is, you use those to your advantage for like wind bracketing, using a dot or a half a dot or between dots to up that hit percentage. You don't really need to get into the knowing the wind within 1 mile per hour. My definition of an elite wind reader is getting to the wind speed within 1 mile per hour and isolating the angle to within 15 degrees or half an hour on a clock. That's an elite wind reader. If you can do that, but you don't really need to do that like with a 6.5 Creedmoor, probably until you're shooting past 1,100 yards, and with a 308, not until you're shooting past 900 yards. So, and with a 375 Shytac, not until you get past about 2,500 yards. So you don't always have to do those things. And that's what slows guys down. And you have to build your own process around what this particular shooting task is.
Okay. I got you. Yeah, and that's the big thing is we've got also a lot of hunters on here that listen to the show, and they all kind of they all want to know the same thing. If we're shooting it, and the target's a lot bigger, right? It's a full L-size target. It's not center mass on a person. It's not, an 8-inch target at 600 yards. It's not that kind of stuff. But, they've got a little bit more room for error on that kind of stuff. But one of the biggest things I know that I have problems with is number one, reading wind at target. And number two, what is the wind doing between me and the target? Because everybody, holds their Kestrel up on the line and they're like, okay, it's a good solid 10 miles an hour, and you've also got to understand of when you're shooting, how to read that wind, like on your face or something like that. Because I've been in the middle of a lot of stages or, out hunting, and all of a sudden I can just feel it stop. And training my brain to go, okay, now you got to hurry and adjust your shot before you make that trigger break, right? And that's kind of what some of the things that I wanted to go over with you tonight is how do you do that?
Well, you can make some assumptions. A common way of looking at wind in depth to the target is by breaking the ranges into thirds. So the distance from you to the target, break it into thirds. That's a pretty good way of doing it. And so first third, second third, final third, which is the most important third? There's kind of arguments to be made for all of those. The first third is very important because, just like if you're using a compass and you're walking in the woods and you start off, 5 degrees off azimuth and you start off off azimuth, by the time you get to your destination, you're going to be very far off course. Same thing happens with the wind affecting a bullet at short range. It continues off its path. Bullets aren't self-correcting. Once you give that bullet a new vector, it's going to continue to go in that direction. So the first third is very important because of that. The middle third is important because that's where your bullet is the highest off of the ground. We know wind increases in speed as it gets higher off the ground. This is a condition called wind gradient or wind shear. And there's some pretty complicated formulas that people use to kind of predict this stuff. They use it in like wind power generation, architecture, things like that to know that, hey, if the wind is 5 miles per hour, 2 meters off the ground, what is the wind 30 meters off of the ground? And that wind shear or gradient is contingent upon the nature of the terrain. So the smoother the terrain, the less of a difference there is between wind on the ground that you measure it and the wind high in the air. Like, so with a 308 at, 1,000 yards, your bullet's about 18 feet in the air. So say, if I'm measured at 6 feet in the air, 5 miles per hour, across like a kind of a classic rifle range where there's not a lot of terrain, maybe some berms, some rolling hills, the wind is probably only going to increase maybe 6-7%. So you can say, okay, the wind's kind of monolithic. Hey, if I'm measuring it here, that's my expectation all the way to the target. But if I'm shooting over very broken terrain or urban terrain, the wind can change by as much as double or 3 times the speed based on the nature of the terrain, because wind functions like a fluid. So it's subject to friction. So the more broken the terrain, the more the wind is slowed near the ground. So that's where you're measuring it. We all know that if you're lying down and you have your kestrel and you stand up with your kestrel, the wind's always a little bit faster. It's the same sort of thing that goes on. So you have to, and there's some coefficients you can apply to these formulas, but it's nothing that you're ever going to do in the field. The expectation is that's might be an experience part of understanding how much the wind might increase with speed, with altitude. And then the final third, the wind is blowing, the bullet is going its slowest, and it has its lowest ballistic coefficient. Ballistic coefficient is tied to velocity. So the lower the velocity, the less the ballistic coefficient is. So at that final third, the bullet can maybe drift more than it would in the first third, but it's there, and it's also there the longest. Dan Perriard, who is part of Invisti, which is like Nick Vitalbo's company. They do all kinds of high-speed, big brain stuff, and he wrote a great article on this. People should go check it out and read it. It's the letter N, VISTI.com is the website, and it's called Where the Wind Matters. And by doing some analysis, basically, until the bullet is about Mach 1.2 or 3, the first third is about 50% of the wind. The middle third is about 35% of the wind, and the final third is about 15% of the wind. So to your initial point, Cole, I look at the first third, and then I see if the middle third agrees with the first third. I tend not to really worry about the final third unless I'm shooting and I know my bullet is going down below Mach 1.2 or even going through trans into subsonic. So unless there's something with the terrain that's going to cause the wind to be different at the middle third than it is where I can see it in the first third, that's where I take my initial measurement, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Yeah, no, totally. You got anything to add to that, JD?
No, that's pretty much kind of where we teach. We maybe emphasize a little bit more on the entire spectrum and maybe too much on that last third when we look at just students, making sure and this goes into making sure parallax is good on the target for watching trace. So we have a little bit different take on it, but it's for different reasons.
Right. Yeah. I think one thing I need to hit on for our hunters out west, I'm a hunter. I've got a lot of friends that are hunters. I know there's going to be hunters listening to this. So, here in the high elevations, you've got big valleys, you're shooting from one valley to the next, you're shooting across things. And you come up to an elk, you already got freaking buck fever. You're trying to figure out exactly what you're going to do. Now I've heard analogies at this, and I kind of want to know what you guys do. Now, a lot of people look at maybe the trees above it and they kind of read and figure out how it is. There's ways, to train your brain how to read trees, how to read grass, how to read, certain things like that to make known that, okay, this tree is moving. This gives you about 5 miles an hour. The tree's really moving. This is about 10 to 20 miles an hour. Understanding exactly how that tree. So when you guys go out and train, how do you do it? I've heard different versions of this. But I want to hear how you guys do it.
Go ahead, JD.
Okay. We do two things. First, the biggest thing is getting guys over their hesitation of just calling a wind and breaking a shot. Well, we teach really short wind formula that Todd Hotnett has published for a long time with accuracy first. And the really big thing is, hey, just make a wind call, but make it miles per hour. We find big issues when guys make a wind call in mils because it doesn't translate from 308 to 300 to 6.5 to 50 cal. If they can call it in miles per hour, translate it to mils, then you either say, yes, that was dead on, or no, that was 0.2 mils off. So 0.2 mils within 500 meters is about a mile an hour. So I was a mile an hour shy or a mile an hour heavy, something like that. That helps them train in, one, how to read it and how to make a correction, and how to actually critique themselves. But then two, not a lot of students, not a lot of people I've seen actually do this is go out with a partner, stand next to the vegetation we're going to shoot with a kestrel and just say, hey, what do you think the wind speed is from a guy who's sitting 200, 300, 400 meters away with a spotting scope or just a piece of glass? And you can say, oh, it's 5 miles an hour or something like that. And the guy there with the Kestrel can say, yep, it's blowing between, say, 3 and 4, something like that, 3 and 5. He actually has the metric there so you can train it. And then when he's doing that, take video if you can. Because then you can go back and study and say, hey, I know this is exactly a 5 mile an hour wind with the effects on this bush, on this tree, on this grass, etc. And that way you can build a library and a catalog of what wind actually does where you're shooting. Those are the things that we kind of push.
Yeah, and I same exact thing. You know, when I was a coach and I had lots of young soldiers, it was great. I'd have those guys go down range with a Kestrel and a radio, and I'd have a radio, and I'd look through my spot and scope and have them stand next to some veg. I'm like, hey man, what's Kestrel say? He's like, it says 7 miles an hour, Sergeant. I'm like, and then I try to calibrate my eye to what that was doing. Mm-hmm. But from your initial question, like, you know, here's the thing. You should be as prepared as you can for any type of shooting condition or your shooting event. So, for example, you know, I was shooting a match this last week down in Phoenix. So I did very basic things. I looked at the weather report. I looked at the forecast. I looked at, you know, an app called Windy or whatever it is. And I would, or Weather Underground, and I would have an expectation of what the wind is doing. So, and, you know, and in the military context, you know, there's guys that get paid to be weathermen, you know, so you lean on those guys. So you have kind of an understanding what the basic general condition is, especially if you're shooting across terrain. So I'm on a ridge line, I'm shooting across a valley. I may not feel very much wind in my location. Maybe I can't really see what the wind is doing in the valley. So, yeah, I'm going to look at the target. I'm going to see if I see any grass moving or anything. And that's where you really have to train yourself. You know, what does vegetation look like when the wind is blowing? Can you determine left and right wind in long, tall grass? You know, so there's lots. You just need to look at it. Whenever I get out of the grocery store and I'm walking to my car here just outside Seattle, Washington, I'm looking at the tops of trees. I'm looking at the flag outside the post office. I'm looking at what I can see from mirage on the top of car roofs. I'm always looking at the wind, always. These are skills that you can like inculcate. You know, when I was, you know, back when I was in the Army and I did a lot of range estimation stuff, I would, driving down the road, I'd try to range estimate a sign, an exit sign, and in the distance, and then I would like look at my odometer and I would test to see how good my like visual range estimation was. You do the same thing with the wind. You're always working on those skills. So try to have an understanding of what you think the wind might be doing, and then look at things that either confirm your thoughts or go, okay, it's. I had a shooter that shot for me, and I think JD's probably heard the story before, but he was from Alabama. And he used to say, it ain't never not worth nothing, number one. And the second thing he said was, the bullet never leaves the barrel and says, fuck it, I'm going upwind. So if you take that like as your like number one thing, like, so if you see anything, like what's your, you know, try to maximize percentage of that hit. So if I'm shooting at an elk, what's the area of that elk that I think that I have to hit, and always try to play what we call the pro side in the wind. So the pro side means that you're trying to miss upwind. Amateurs miss downwind, pros miss upwind. So try to and do the pro side of that. And then look around for things that either confirm or deny your initial thoughts on a wind call.
I got you. Yeah, and I've heard kind of different stories about that before, to where I can't remember who it was. I think it's Scott Satterley or somebody said he always keeps a Kestrel in his pocket, and he'll walk outside and he'll look around him if he's got a few minutes and hold out his Kestrel and see exactly what that's doing, and he's just imprinting it in his mind. Because, I mean, you go through and you spend thousands of dollars on a tag, or you go spend a whole lot of time near your loading room, you go do all that kind of stuff, but you're not investing the time when it comes to reading the wind. Because you can have the best freaking load in the world. You know, everybody posts these pictures of a .01, no SDs, really low ESs. That doesn't do you any good if you're not going to be able to read it. And that's one of the big things. And then the other thing in my brain that makes a lot of sense is being able to understand your reticle and how to measure with that. Going off of, okay, when it splashes or when it hits dust, what is my dust doing? It goes into a lot of that stuff too. And again, I don't think people put as much thought into that kind of thing as they probably should be.
There's always something to see. There's always something out there that's going to tell you a story. You can look across, a flat, no vegetation, surface, and you're going to be able to see something with regard to wind. Mirage, sometimes it's hard to pick up if there isn't, depending on the light conditions, or if there isn't the ground or a background there, or maybe that means you have to look way over the target because there are some power lines on the horizon, and maybe you can pick up some mirage off of those power lines. Maybe there's some insects or some dandelion stuff in the air. You can look at that. So there's always something to see, and there's always something to base your wind call on. I would doing a little homework. So if I was a hunter, if I was an elk hunter, and depending on my caliber and the bullet I was shooting, I would do a little research, and I would say, okay, how wide in miles per hour is the area that I'm trying to shoot at these different distances? I mean, when I coach the extreme long range stuff, if you've ever kind of looked over my shoulder at what I'm doing, I have a little little notepad, and on that notepad is a sketch of the target, and I have how many what 1 mile per hour the wind does at that range in mils or minutes of angle, whatever we're using. Also, how wide the target is in minutes of angle or mils at that range, and how many miles per hour it is wide. So you always should have an idea about what the wind is, what your bullet is doing at the target. I mean, that's the number one thing. You can't, unless getting surprised by the wind and not having a plan means that you're literally just guessing. So you have to, it's not definite, until we have devices that work, out past a kilometer that everybody can afford to read the wind. You're going to have to make guesses and assumptions. I get the wind wrong all the freaking time. I mean, all the time, but the more you try to put numbers on it, the better your percentage gets.
Okay. We've got a quick question. Looks straight from Derek. It says, on a known distance range on a sunny day, what do you trust more, flags or mirage?
So, okay. So this is about like NRA style shooting. So you're on a range. They have these wind flags, and they also have, you can also use mirage as a wind reading tool. I look at flags more than anything else. If I have them, because what mirage is different layers, and I'm sure there's an engineer out there, super smart guys that'll tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, but the mirage is basically different layers of air that are heated at different temperatures. So the closer you get to the ground, the air temperature changes because it's getting close to what that ground temperature is. So those different layers of air can refract the light. So that's kind of what you're seeing with mirage. So, but mainly when we're looking at mirage, we're looking at it basically in a little tube that our spotting scope is all the way to the target. And you may only be 3 or 4 feet above the ground. So and that mirage can be spoofed by terrain. If you have something in the terrain that causes a little obstruction in the wind, if the wind has to get over it, on the other side of that obstruction, the wind's going to be sort of turbulent and disturbed. So that will affect the mirage. I mean, I've been on rifle ranges where there's a long tree line on one side of the range, and the wind is blowing this way, and the tree's here, and the wind hits the trees and kind of rolls up and kind of does this. And so it looks like the wind is actually blowing the opposite direction in the mirage, but that's not what's happening with the wind. So the reason why I like wind flags in a competitive shooting environment like F-class or stuff like that is that the wind is physically blowing the flag physically blowing the flag. So flags are typically more true than mirages. Mirage is a great tool, but you really need to use both. Make sure that the flags and mirage agree before you really start using the mirage. I actually use the mirage more for finding the direction of the wind, and so that helps me determine what the angle of the wind is. That's actually what I use the mirage the most for, is turning my scope into the wind until I see a boil. And then the direction my scope or my binos are, that's the direction of the wind. And that's something that you can use in the field. And it's not really just limited to, a competitive shooting environment.
So let me kind of back up just a little bit on that. Now, a lot of people want to know how to read mirage. You hear a lot, back it out of parallax, get it a little bit grainy, figure that out. What do you guys recommend for reading mirage when it comes across? Because, when I was down shooting with JD in North Carolina, you get a lot of different heat waves down there than you do here in Utah. And, they stay real low, they boil, they do that kind of stuff. So how do you guys recommend reading the mirage with the scope?
Well, with us, that's really what we primarily focus on, just because, oftentimes we don't have the luxury of wind flags. So when it comes to mirage, biggest thing is zooming in, getting crisp on the target, and backing out like just a little bit like you're saying, Cole. Then pulling your power all the way down as low as you can get. With that too, a lot of students get focused on reading mirage right there at the target, and what they fail to understand is that parallax plane. It's like if you think of it like a piece of glass that you're sliding forward and back. When that's set properly, if you go down and you have a bunch of sand or grass like we have on a lot of our ranges, if you find one of those sand roads where that sand hits that grass with that texture change, mirage is read really well there where that parallax plane is set, even though it's maybe 100 meters to the left and 200 meters in, as we see it or as the range sits. So I look for those hard lines. I look for range markers that we have out there too, which are really big pieces of plywood. Those hard, crisp lines, I can read mirage incredibly well there, and that's where I look. And it's in my entire field of view. It's not just right there by the target, because that's really, like Emil said, when you get focused on the target and fixated and kind of stare into the center of that soda straw, it just doesn't give you the information you need for a proper adjustment.
Yeah, and another thing about like the mirage is an excellent indicator of wind direction. So, I've seen lots of shooting books. I've got a bunch of them. I kind of collect some of these old timey shooting books, and they all have like these pictures of like mirage, and it's like a bunch of like wavy, shitty lines like this, and these lines mean that, and these lines mean 8 miles an hour, and these lines mean. It doesn't look. I've never seen one of those pictures that looked anything like what it looks like when you look at looking through a spotting scope. But one thing that is easy to kind of communicate to people is a boil, right? So a boil means that you just don't see the mirage being blown in any direction, left or right. So this kind of gets into something I think I want to talk about, which is about how to figure out what percentage of the wind you want to do. So, my process is very simple. First, you need to figure out the wind speed. You can do that with a Kestrel, or as we've talked about, like observing different physical effects. This bush does that, and the grass does this, and whatever. I know when I feel the wind in my wizard beard, it's about 4 miles an hour, 4 miles an hour. And when I stand with my feet flat-footed on like a hard surface, and a wind gust moves my fat butt, kind of feel like I'm getting rocked on the balls of my feet. That's right at 14 miles an hour. I just know that, right? So. So wind speed, and then you have to figure out the direction. And the wind direction is important because wind direction is what we call value. So it's pretty easy to understand that if the wind is blowing perpendicular to the bullet's flight, then it affects the bullet the most. 100% of that wind speed affects the bullet. But at what those different angles and how they affect the wind speed, that is I think it's a misunderstood thing. And so the clock system is kind of what we use in shooting to identify wind direction. And the clock system has different percentages of wind. And this is where new shooters get it wrong all the time, which is why we have a pro side and an amateur side. So if I know that straight onto the target or the boil is 0 value, so I could have a 20-mile-an-hour wind, but it's blowing right in my face. It doesn't have a discernible effect left or right on my bullet's flight. And if I have that same wind blowing 90 degrees, then I have that entire wind speed affecting it. But so between 0 and 90, so 0 is no value, 90 is full value. So you ask the guy on the street, hey, what is half value? He's probably going to say 45 degrees, because it's halfway between 0 and 90. So we've all been on the range, and a guy looks down range and he's like, okay, the wind's coming right around 1:30, 2 o'clock. That's about half value. It's not half value, bro. That's like 75% of the wind. So the wind's function is trigonometric. It's a function of the sine of the angle relative to your gun target line or your direction of fire. So if I'm shooting 0 degrees, if you type in 0, hit the sine button, it is 0%. If I'm shooting 90 degrees, you type 90, hit the sine button, it's 1 or 100%. If I'm shooting at 1 o'clock or 30 degrees and I hit the sine of 30, that is 0.5 or 50%. So those wind angles in clock direction are a function of the sine of the angle. And the clock direction is great because 1 o'clock is 30 degrees, 2 o'clock is 60 degrees, 3 o'clock is 90 degrees. 12:30 is 15 degrees, 1:30 is 45 degrees, 2:30 is 75 degrees. So you can figure out what those, and that's where those charts come in about the wind value, the old kind of rosette kind, which is a circle and has all the numbers going all the way out, and the numbers change as you go around on the clock. That's because of those wind percentages are changing based on the wind value. So I teach, and like a lot of other guys do, kind of a simplified version of that, of the wind angle and the value. So obviously 12 o'clock is 0, 12:30, we're talking 15 degrees, right? So 12:30 is 15 degrees. That's 25% of the wind. And 1 o'clock or 30 degrees is 50% of the wind. And 1:30 or 45 degrees, actually the sine of 45 is 0.71, but I rounded up to 75 degrees. Make it easy to do the math. And 2 o'clock or 60 degrees is 87%, so I rounded up to 90. And when you get over to 2:30 or 75 degrees, it's like 96%. So anything past 2 o'clock, I call full value or 100%. So going from 12 to all the way across, it's 0 in half an hour, 0, 25%, 50%, 75%, 90% at 2 o'clock. Then anything past 2 o'clock, I just call full value. So you measure the wind speed, you figure out what that value is, and that gives you your effective crosswind. And that process is pretty much the same no matter what kind of system you're using. If you're using a ballistic reticle that has wind dots in it, or if you're just using your dope, all those things are always given in full value effects. And the cool thing about value is you can apply that percentage to your full value dope. So if I know that, a full value 10-mile-an-hour wind at 1,000 meters is like 1.3 mils with a 308, and it's a 50% wind, I can actually apply that 50% dope to 1.3, so I hold like 0.6 mils if it's a 50% wind, or I can apply that percentage to the wind speed and then use that wind speed with my dots or my dope or whatever. So that's the process: velocity and value. And that's the way guys that look at wind flags on these competitive shooting ranges, same thing. You're looking at not only the wind speed, which kind of is shown to you by the height of the flag, but also the value, which is shown as the angle of the flag relative to the target. And that's it. You now know as much as I do about it.
Yeah, I can see people's brains just trying to figure this out. But that's the thing, is you can come back to this, re-listen to it, re-engage it, and you can even go into more in depth about this with spin drift and different things, because whichever way your bullet's spinning, that's going to, mess with it even more. that, I mean, we can go into a whole nother side of this, but I kind of wanted to keep it more on the wind side. Now, I know you coach a lot of the ELR stuff. Now, ELR is extreme long range. Usually it's what, 1,500 yards and beyond is what they figure out as ELR.
Typically, yeah, that's kind of the definition. Past a mile, really.
And it's been taken off big time. I mean, you see a lot of this King of 2 Mile, Paul Phillips, Brantley, these guys that are out there with giant guns trying to send great big bullets at a long range, and trying to break, the wind, trying to put the biggest, highest BC bullet out there to try and get to the point of impact. Now, what does wind say? What effect does it have? Now I'm kind of new to ELR. I shot all PRS type stuff. On one of them giant bullets out of a 338 or 375, what kind of wind does it have on something that has that much mass?
So, I mean, it's the wind, right? So it's all relative. Shooting a 375 ShyTac at like a mile is probably equivalent to reading the wind with a 308 at about 800 yards in terms of like scale. So it's really not that hard. But once you get past, you start getting past 2,000 yards, 2,500 yards, 3,000 yards, your bullet is down to the low end of Mach 1.3, 1.4, or even less. So you have to really get within that 1 mile per hour and 15 degree of angle neighborhood to get a good wind call. But other things that go into it are, you mentioned spin drift and things like that. Those are effects that I usually don't worry about unless I'm shooting, unless they become, a significant portion of the target size. So, if I'm shooting out to 6, 7, 800 yards, and it's only my spin drift might only be 0.1 or 0.2 mils, I tend not to worry about it. I might just dial it out on my windage knob and just kind of forget about it. But when you shoot at those ranges, you have to input everything into your solver. You have to input the latitude, the direction of fire. If there's even a small angle up towards the targets of 4 or 5 degrees, you should probably input that into your solver as well. And the actual wind direction, you should probably input in your solver, because there's a thing called aerodynamic jump, which is when the bullet leaves the barrel. So we're talking within the first less than 50 feet, because of the direction of twist of a bullet, a barrel. So if it's with a right-hand twist barrel, wind from the left will cause the bullet to deflect down slightly, and wind from the right will cause the bullet to go up slightly. That effect happens near the muzzle, but if it's 0.1 or so mils, by the time you get out to 2 miles, you're talking, it means multiple inches at those ranges. So you have to make sure all your inputs are correct. And then you really need to isolate that wind. But the best thing to do is use the wind at one location to at the farther location. So, back in the NRA sort of high power service rifle days, if you had the wind at 300 yards and your next stage of fire was 600 yards, the old school kind of rule of thumb was double it and add a quarter minute. So if I had 2 minutes of wind down at 300 yards, I could just double it. So I would shoot 4 and 4.25 minutes of wind at 600 yards. That's assuming a constant or steady wind. It means that it's worth more at the farther distance. So what I teach a lot for ELR, and also in the tactical environment, guys are using unknown distance shooting. If you hit a target at any range, you can figure out exactly how much wind was blowing when you hit that target, if you knew how many mils or minutes of angle you were holding on the target. Or if you're like JD said earlier, if you're thinking about the wind in miles per hour, then you're already golden. So if I hit a target at say at 1,000 yards, this particular rifle, it's 0.2 mils per mile per hour. So if I hit a target and with 2 mils of wind, well, then how much wind was actually blowing? So if 1 mile an hour wind is 0.2 and I hit it with 2 mils, what was my mile per hour velocity of crosswind? It was 10, right? because 2 divided by 0.2 is 10. So I was dealing with the 10-mile-per-hour wind. I'm shooting in the same general direction. My next target, say 2,000 yards, and I look down on my Kestrel and it says, hey, at 2,000 yards, it's 0.95 mils per mile per hour. Okay, so if I'm dealing with 10 miles an hour, if I was using 2 mils at this one range, I just multiply 10 times my 1 mile an hour number. So if it's 0.95, then it's 9.5 mils. I mean, that's probably not a real wind number, but that's how it works. So if you can, and that's the same thing, like if you, and JD could probably talk about this better than I can, when guys are using their wind dots in a Horus reticle, of how to use those effectively if you're shooting at targets in depth. You shoot at close target, next target, far target. It's super easy if you pay attention to how much wind is you hit the close target with.
Yeah, it definitely is. One of the guys like the old Horus reticles, it's kind of hard to get them over to the wind dots. They think they just like mills, but once guys get the hang of the wind dots, it's pretty hard to get them off of it. Essentially, it's all I'm doing is wherever that bullet lands, that's my mile per hour. So with the 308, I run my wind dots up to 4 miles an hour per wind dot. So if it lands between my first and my second wind dot, I'm about 6 miles an hour. And that's where, too, when I call wind with wind dots, I'm not worried about necessarily a hard 6. Hey, it's 6-ish, or it's between 5 and 7, somewhere in there. And then all I do is I place that overlay, that space in between the 2 dots, on all my other targets until the bullets tell me something different with the wind. Because really, the bullet's going to tell you exactly what's going on. And that's another thing that guys kind of struggle with. They look and they see their impacts, and they have preconceived notions. They don't want to believe what the wind's actually pushing.
Interesting. Yeah, this is all kind of, it's amazing to me how much more in depth you can go into this. And, a lot of these guys are going out buying the new tricklers and everything else, and they're not investing into this. I can't say it enough. Take your time, learn this stuff. And a lot of it, your Kestrel does it for you. If you just learn how to input your stuff correctly, and you make sure that you're paying attention to input your stuff correctly. I want to go real quick, I don't mean to take away from it, but a lot of people see behind me these bullet sheets. He contacted me the other day, and he'd like to give a couple of them away to some of our listeners. So if you're listening live, if you're viewing live, go over to their Facebook page. It's chamber.it on Facebook. And if you're listening on the podcast, go on the Facebook page when you listen to this and comment on which one you like, and we're going to give a few of these away. He's got a whole bunch of different types. There's European, he's got tank, he's got the American Standard, he's got pistol. These things are awesome for your loading rooms, and he wants to give a few of them away. Again, it's chamber.it on Facebook. Go comment and tell him which one you like. Now, one of the other things is, coming from the ballistics background that I have, a lot of people look at a box, especially hunters. They look at a box and it's got a certain BC on there and it's got a certain velocity on there. What a lot of them do not understand is that BC and that velocity was gotten with a certain barrel. Now, a lot of ammo manufacturers nowadays do that because SAMI spec, which that's a whole other thing, and I don't want to get into it. But we've got to check, barrel length, twist rate, all that kind of thing. And I wanted to kind of go through that with you, Emil, because, you've got the burger side, you got that kind of thing. How do these guys understand, these guys and gals understand the velocity and BC consistency?
So, ballistic coefficient it's a number that kind of represents the bullet's efficiency, or a better way of saying it, as Brian Litz says, the bullet's ability to penetrate the air. And what ballistic coefficient really is, it's a combination of 2 numbers. It's a combination of the bullet's sectional density and the form factor of the bullet. So sectional density is pretty easy. That's the weight of the weight and the size of the bullet. So sectional density formula is the weight of the bullet in grains divided by 7,000. So you can convert it into pounds, and then divided by the caliber squared. That gives you sectional density. Then form factor is kind of a number that is based on the G7 or G1 ballistic model that you're so how close it is to that model. So does it outperform that model, or does it underperform that model? So if you have a form factor of 1.0, that means it's an exact match for a G7 or a G1 ballistic performance from the theoretical projectile. So the number also changes by velocity. So if you measure ballistic coefficient right at the muzzle when it comes out at, 2,900 feet per second, and then if you measure that same ballistic coefficient when it hit a target 1,000 yards away where it's only doing 1,400 feet per second, you're going to have two different numbers. So you have to be careful about what number you're seeing. Some manufacturers put a short range number on the box. We at Burger, we put an average BC number on the box. So we put a number on the box that's good for down to about 1,500 feet per second. So that's usually, so with a 308, that's about 800 yards or so. And with a 6.5 Creedmoor, that's probably 900 to 1,000 yards. And we use that number mainly so it's a usable number the person can put into a ballistic solver or Kestrel and be able to use it. So that's first thing is the ballistic coefficient is an expression of how well the bullet performs in the air. So the shape of its trajectory and also how well it does within the wind. But something that's, I think, even more important than the number of a ballistic coefficient is how consistent that ballistic coefficient is. Before I took this job at Burger, I was kind of a failed English major, so I didn't know anything about how to make a bullet, man. So when I went down to Burger, when I first got hired, and I saw how they made those bullets, it blew my mind. And you realize that you're moving metal around. So if you take, 1,000 bullets, they're all different slightly somehow. So when a person tests a BC, if they just shoot a few bullets, those bullets may be different than the bullets that you have in your box. You may be off 2, 3, 4% even from that one number. And then the other thing that happens is, depending on how well the bullet is made or the condition of your barrel, or if your barrel isn't twisted fast enough to stabilize a bullet, you may have a variation in ballistic coefficient in the air. So that's something we really didn't know a lot about until we got radar. Radar is pretty common within the industry now. We have one. I know Hornady has a radar. And so all of our bullet data now that we put out there is based on radar data. So, we can see with this type of radar, usually bullets out to about 1,500 yards till they hit the ground. So that actually gives us a coefficient of drag. We can actually ping off the base of the bullet in flight, hundreds of times what the bullet is doing. So we can get time of flight data. We can actually see how stable a bullet is in flight all the way down range. And so what we've seen is bullet design, makes a huge difference in how consistent that ballistic coefficient is. So I see Derek Datner, his question is, what is the best way to segregate bullets for BC consistency? The best way to segregate bullets for BC consistency is to buy bullets that have consistent BC, like a Burger. So, that's my plug for the company. There's other Sierra makes great bullets, Hornady makes great bullets. Don't get me wrong, but it all starts with the internal construction of that bullet. What we've seen is some things that you can do to bullets help their performance. So having a bullet pointed, it makes BC more consistent. Also, where the center of gravity is in that bullet, with stability in flight, makes that bullet more consistent in flight. So our new long-range hybrid target bullets are both pointed and they have a slightly shifted center of gravity. So we're holding 1% or less BC consistency in flight. And like you mentioned earlier, Cole, guys have auto tricklers and, guys are weighing powder to a kernel. If you have an SD of 3 feet per second, but if your BC varies 2.5% across 20 bullets that you shoot, you're basically simulating having an SD of 20 feet per second in the air. So what we used to do at the AMU was we would separate bullets by overall length. We didn't really weigh bullets. I don't recommend weighing bullets to segregate them for consistency. Weight of a bullet is pretty much linear in how it affects the BC. So, for example, I know you can weigh bullets because you can. It's the middle of the winter, or you want to go in the garage because your wife's yelling at you, and your kids suck. So you go in the garage to get out of there and weigh some bullets. So, I mean, I get emails all the time like, hey, man, I bought these Burger 140s and I found like 3 that were 139.8 grains. So what do you think? I'm like, well, for a bullet's BC to change by 1%, the weight of the bullet has to change by 1%. So unless you're seeing weight differences, if you're shooting 140s, unless you're seeing weight differences of half of like 0.7 grains to 1.4 grains, you're still less than 0.5% of BC change just by weight. But we used to sort bullets by overall length. And what you're doing there is overall length of a projectile is a form factor issue. If you could actually measure the nose length of bullets and separate them that way, that is a extremely good way of unifying ballistic coefficient by nose length.
Do you recommend, so like a lot of times we use, coming from the ballistic side like I have, we used a lot of the ogive tools, like Hornady makes one. So that's the thing, is a lot of the nose profile is different on a lot of the bullets, and even if you measure overall length on some of them, they're all gonna, just like you said. So would you rather measure from the base of the ogive or the base of the tip, depending on if they're tipped or not, of course?
Well, it depends. So I'll give you one answer, and I know other people have a different answer. Base to ogive for me is an internal ballistics. I think you have to look at the causality of it. So if you measure base to ogive and then you measure overall length, and if those two measurements have coincidence, so if the shorter bullets base to ogive are shorter overall length, or the longer base to ogive is longer overall length, or vice versa, then I would use that. Base to ogive measurements are usually for seating depth control. So that's an internal ballistics thing. So for your load, and these modern hybrid bullets, I don't shoot any of them that I jump less than about 40 thousandths, honestly. I jump the shit out of all those hybrids, and they shoot very well jumping like that. So if I'm jumping a bullet 50 thousandths, if my seat depth is off 3 or 4 thousandths from bullet to bullet, you never see that on the target. But overall length measurement's pretty easy to do. Any dial caliper, and the way we used to do it, this is one kind of moment in time, one quick TTP. But for our 1,000-yard 308 ammunition, I threw that buzzword in there for JD. For a 1,000-yard 308 ammo that we used to shoot at the AMU, we'd go down to the loading room, and I would draw out the 15,000 Sierra 155 grain bullets that we were going to shoot that season, and I'd measure like 100 of them, and I'd write all the measurements down, and I would try to get like basically a width of what kind of gap am I looking at? So the shortest of the longest bullet. So if the shortest of the longest bullet was like, say, 24 thousandths, I would separate them into groups, like 8 different groups, batches, and I would group them by like 3 thousandths of an inch. And then I would take all those little individual lots and I would bring them down to our loading guys, and that's what how they would load our lots of ammo. So that all those lots of ammo all those bullets were within about 3 thousandths of each other. And I think that's a pretty good number to use. And you'll find that if you weigh bullets, just like lots of other things in the world, they kind of go into a bell curve. And so you're going to find the biggest sample right under the mean of the bell curve. And then by units of standard deviation, bell curves are there for a reason. It actually happens all the time in nature. So we would kind of try to shoot the bullets that were under the mean of the bell curve, and because those other lots were usually pretty small. But we did a lot of testing at 1,000 yards out of return to battery fixtures and rail guns, and all that stuff always decreased the elevation on the target, always. So that meant that our shots had less vertical on the target at 1,000 yard. It works 100%.
Yeah, and just to add to that, what a lot of people don't understand, what is radar. A lot of people say, Doppler radar, different things. So what that does is it tracks a bullet over a given amount. What it does is it tracks the back of it.
Right.
It's used to kind of measure, and all of it's done in a curve. Whether it's however it is, but that's one of the big things that everybody needs to understand is there's a place in most of your ballistics apps where you can go in and true your BC. Now, if you don't have a lab radar, if you don't have a magneto speed or different things, you can go in and true that, and it'll figure backwards what a lot of the times your velocity is, and it'll true all that up for you. And that's something I recommend highly to do, even if you think you know the velocity and everything, is go back through and true it and make sure that's what it is. I was lucky when I worked at Barnes because I had all the GC, I had all the custom drag curves made for my stuff. I still shot like crap, but I had the excuse that I could use it. But make sure that if you're using a ballistic software solution, use one that will let you true it. That's something that I want you to make sure that everybody kind of takes away from this, is going through it. Don't believe what's on the box. Those standards that are out there are just that. They're a standard, but they're not exactly what's going to be in it. It goes back to what, Emil's been saying, and especially with hunters and different things like that. Go through and spend your time to true it. Go ahead.
Well, truing is a thing where, sometimes truing your ballistic solution to get prediction, to increase your get a better prediction at ranges, that actually might mean changing the muzzle velocity you just got with your lab radar that is right. Like, you get your lab radar, magneto speed. I've got 3 magneto speeds on the barrel. I'm shooting across 17 lab radars. I know without a doubt there's no way that it's not 3,000 feet per second. Yet if I put 3,000 feet per second into my solver, I'm not hitting the target. I'm high or I'm low. And then you do the truing exercise. The reason why we have to do that, it goes back to my earlier point about BC consistency. That bullet may not have the same BC as its brother that was measured a year ago or 2 years ago. And what we know now after shooting a lot of things over radar is that even individual barrels, so 2 Bartline barrels, both 1-8 twist, one has 200 rounds on it, one has 600 rounds on it. They actually have different ballistic coefficients in flight. The nature of the riflings, anything can actually affect the ballistic coefficient of that bullet. So sometimes you find you're truing mainly to get your solution in line to what you're observing, rather than trying to make sure you have a perfect velocity. And using a custom drag model, which the Hornady solver uses custom drag models, and the Applied Ballistics Kestrel uses custom drag models. You still have to true those by velocity, because you're trying to get that curve to overlay the actual curve of your bullet. So don't get so married to the BC or to your velocity. The end goal is to hit the bloody target, and the bullet doesn't lie, right? So you're going to have to look at it and go, and knowing where to true is very important too. You should be truing where the solver tells you to true. JD, when you guys are truing, are you truing right at that transonic, that Mach 1.2 or whatever that it says, or do you guys do something different?
So we try to do Mach 1.2. Generally speaking, we go a little bit into Mach when we should come out and true on the close end about 10% or within 10%. But we don't see too many issues. One of the big things that we've seen with the students is, going back to what you said about not being married too much to that BC, or really that muzzle velocity, is everyone who's out there, if you guys play with the G7 and the G1 curves, if you true with the G1 curve, and then go input that muzzle velocity to a G7 curve, you're going to miss a little bit. Because of how that G7 is read versus how the G1 is read, you get two varying muzzle velocities. And throw in custom drag curve, and you get a third one too. So when we do true, we try to do multiple systems. So try to use a magneto. Then once we have the magneto, confirm it with a true, something like that. Always overlapping redundant systems that we can actually find out what's going on, rather than kind of like Emil says, really go down a rabbit hole where it's like, I'm just looking at one thing and it's saying it, but something's wrong here.
And at distance, when you're truing, like, so, lots of, when you're truing for muzzle velocity, the solvers want you to true around Mach 1.2, which is pretty far away. I mean, if you consider you're launching your bullet about Mach 2.2 to Mach 2.5, depending on the caliber, or even higher, Mach 1.2, like for a 308, is 800 and something meters in most sort of atmospheric conditions. So if you're shooting a semi-automatic gas gun that maybe is shooting 1 to 1.5 minutes or worse, or 2 minutes, that means that now you're trying to true on a system. So guys are trying to true to like 0.1 mils on a system that their gun might only be shooting 0.4 or 0.5 mil size groups, or close to 2 minutes of angle, and you really need to true at around a third to a half minute of angle to put it on the MOA side. So it's really important that you just don't hit the rock one time, or you hit the steel one time, you're like, I got it, that's my true, because you may have just compounded the problem and skewed your data even more. So if believe the bullet, but you have to be conscious of your group size downrange as well, and try to find the center of that group. Don't just true with 1 or 2 shots. You need to shoot a few shots, at least 5, 6 shots, to kind of see where the center of that group is.
That's another thing we see too a lot is guys, they focus on that one shot. It's a sniper system. Hey, it's a one-shot system theoretically, but a lot of people don't understand that even though it's still a sniper rifle, it's putting out a cone of fire, not a laser beam. And if they don't know what that mean point of impact is, when it comes to zeroing, when it comes to, like you're talking about with wind calls, where that group's going to lie, like with a WES application, which we can get into later, then that one shot can often lead to a lot of bad calls.
Yeah, and how often do you guys recommend retruing, BC?
Well, I mean, I would say that if I had a lot of ammo and a lot of bullets, and I mean, that's the whole point of having these solvers like that are in with a Kestrel. You've got an atmospheric reading device, and you've got a ballistic solver. So, I've found that, I use the Berger, another shameless plug. I use Berger match ammunition when I shoot my competition stuff. So, I have a lot of it. One lot of ammo, and I might have 800 or 1,000 rounds in this one lot. And so it's all made with one lot of bullets, and I'm shooting it out of one gun. And I find that if I go out there and I true the rifle and I have good confidence in my solver, I'm good. I can go pretty much anywhere with that thing. And as long as I'm letting my environment update and I'm being really diligent in making sure I have good inputs, garbage in, garbage out. That's the way solvers are. It's just a freaking computer, man. Yeah. It's, the computer, it's like elevator door. If you think about solvers and computers, if you have an elevator door and you put a pencil in the elevator door, and it'll go and it'll stop and then it'll go back out, it'll come back in and it'll stop because it feels the pencil, right? You come back 10 hours later and the elevator is still doing the same freaking thing. So these things aren't smart. So if you enter in the wrong data, we find that most times if a person has a problem with a solver, it's usually because their inputs are wrong. So I find if you're really diligent, I don't have to true again. I mean, if I change ammo, if I change to a different lot of bullets or different lot of ammo, or if I change rifles, then I probably have to true. But one time is probably good enough if you're staying with that one system and that one batch of ammo.
Same thing. We keep guys to about the initial zero and true. Kind of the caveat to that is we use M24s on our course because it's such a good initial rifle to train guys on. After that initial true, they have to quantify why they need a re-true And really kind of what we're looking for is, are they seeing evidence downrange that leads them to need to know or to guess they need to reach through? And really that evidence, what we're looking for is guys saying, hey, I'm seeing vertical dispersion that's either growing or that's growing as I go out. That growing dispersion, that's indicative of muzzle velocity. So that's where we kind of, we'll let them through on the same line a couple times, but only if they see something quantifiable where it's, hey, the gun sped up or something like that with barrel break-in. So
yeah, sometimes guns do speed up in velocity, as we know, as they kind of wear in. Sometimes that happens, but usually most of these problems are due to a poor zero. I see a lot in the training world. You get a new shooter, a new guy, and his actual zero changes because he's starting to shoot the rifle differently. Especially guys shooting semi-autos, their technique changes. It actually changes the point of impact on the target. Or they were started off sloppy as shit and they just settled for half an inch low or an inch low or an inch high, and they called it good because they got frustrated because after the 35th or 40th shot, they're tired and they suck and they're shooting a group the size of a beer can down there and they call it zero. And then, a week later, they're not hit, their data's off because now they're just shooting it differently. So usually the best fix is bring them back down and have them re-zero. And that usually fixes a lot of those problems. It's not a ballistics problem. It's because hey man, I've been really watching what you've been doing and I think I know what your problem is. What's that, Sarge? You're not good. That's the problem. If only you were better at doing this.
You would suck.
This would fix a lot of things. Just get better.
Don't do it.
Right.
Yeah. So, and that's what I tell people. I'm like, okay, they go out there and they shoot a really good little group and they're gone. They leave the range. It's like, shoot a good group, let the gun sit, bring a couple guns with you, maybe shoot some pistols, go back and do it a couple times, make it repetitive so that exactly that you're getting that zero as you're going through it. Because just as you said, it's amazing. Oh shit, I shot this freaking group. Here, take a picture. It's on social media. Did awesome. I feel good. I'm going to the next match. Here I go. Holy shit, I can't hit anything. What'd I do? You didn't freaking take your time, did you? And that comes back to that. And this whole, I want everybody to kind of take this from this entire podcast, this episode, is take your time and learn things. Everybody rushes through it. Everybody's busy. Everybody's got things going on. But do you really want to be a better shooter? Do you want to understand things better? You spend the time in the reloading room, spend the time, with everything else and going out there and shooting it. Because, in my line of business, I had over 1,000 barrels when I was at Barnes. Every one of those barrels was different. Some of the barrels, it took between 100 and 150 rounds to really get that barrel to really get in there. Some of them, they shot good right out of the gate, but that's one of the other big things is understanding the barrel when it comes to what you're going to do with it and how it's set up.
You make an excellent point, Cole. If anybody's ever sat through any of the classes that I've ever taught, my second slide that I put up there is marksmanship. It doesn't matter how good your solver is, how good your gun is. If you suck, if you can't make the barrel not move when you pull the trigger, none of that's going to matter. How well you can read the wind, nothing matters. So whenever guys go to the range, whether it's to confirm zero or whatever it is, spend some time and just work on marksmanship. Try to get your movement as small as it can be. There's that feedback loop. Really good shooters are either dumb as a post and they're just kind of savants, or they're very smart, very analytical people. There's really no in between. You don't kind of just back into being a good shooter. Usually it's guys that they have that sort of constant feedback loop. I see the rifle move as I'm breaking the trigger. I'm watching where the reticle is when I break the shot. I'm calling my shots. I'm doing everything I can to kind of limit my movement. If I feel the movement coming from one part of my body, I try to isolate it, change my position, change my bag, do something to my bipod, whatever it is. You should always work on marksmanship. That should be part of any shooting session. Aim small, miss small. That stuff really matters. I mean, you're shooting a bullet out of a barrel, and if it's not pointed where you think it's pointed, none of this matters.
Right. Yeah, it's the trigger pull, it's the follow through, it's the squeeze, and everything else. There was one other thing that I wanted to ask, and I don't remember that we covered it. One of the big issues that I have, especially out here out west, is I'm down on the gun, I'm ready to break that shot, and all of a sudden the wind dies. Right? How do you guys, in the positions that you guys are, train yourselves to understand and to feel that? Like, is it something that you're looking at your peripherals at something, or is it wind on your face? How do you guys like measure when it dies? Because I've done that a million times where I'm like, okay, I know I need to give it a 0.2 lead. I break the shot and right before the wind died, but I didn't train myself to understand, okay, the wind died, and you've got to hurry and adjust that.
I think you got to be careful, because you have to kind of, if you're feeling the wind at your face and the wind stops, that may not be the case downrange. So kind of knowing what the wind condition is, if it's a headwind, if it's a tailwind, and kind of like, kind of figuring out like what those tells might mean. We were shooting on Easley Range, which is the range at Fort Benning that the AMU is at, and there's a shopette next door to it. So there's a shopette just to the west of the range, and we kind of shot south at that range. And the shopette had a Church's Chicken in it. And the wind condition at that range was almost always out of the right. So if we were shooting a match, if all of a sudden you could smell chicken, dude, you better stop, because that meant that the wind just changed direction, right? So you have to kind of know like where you are and what that means. So if I'm in a headwind and or if I'm in a tailwind, say like in your example, Cole, and I feel the wind stop at my hair or I can feel it on my body, it's going to take a while for that wind to fill in that entire range all the way to the target, So, but then again, if I'm your headwinds and tailwinds, that's where I think setting up your parallax to where you can see mirage is a huge benefit. We train guys to check to adjust their parallax so it's perfect. Move your head up and down so the crosshairs don't move in relation to the target. You do all that stuff, but then you lose a lot of depth of field. You could have small parallax errors and still hit the shit out of targets. You could actually maybe induce a little bit of scope shadow and see same shadow all the way around the scope tube to kind of make sure. I mean, if you have improper parallax, if you have a good position and you're not moving your head around, your eye around behind that sight, you're really not going to see a huge impact downrange. So like JD said, it's an awesome tip. You adjust your parallax so that you can see the mirage in real time. See the mirage, adjust it so it's a little bit farther back. And that's what we used to do at an NRA competition too. We would have our scope set up and you could see the mirage left and right, and you're favoring on the target based on what you can see as the shooter. Because a lot of times you don't have a spotter with you. You're just out there by yourself, or you're doing shooter. Both of you have a rifle. So you have to be able to read the wind through your primary optic, which is your rifle scope as well.
All right. Yeah, that's awesome. Go ahead.
So to bring it back to kind of what Emil said about looking at target size, one of the things that we started stressing a lot more is kind of what he's talked about is look at your target in miles per hour. If I'm holding that 0.2 mils off, Cole, and my crosshairs are still on my target, I don't care. If it's right in the vicinity of where I want to hit it, I'm still going to squeeze that shot off, because if the wind died down that 0.2, it's still going to hit within your quote unquote kill zone, lethal zone, whatever, if you're hunting, and it's still going to be effective. It's still going to be that ethical kill that you're looking for. Even if it's biased a little bit inside and might hit a mile per hour or that 0.2 the other direction, it's still an ethical kill. I mean, 0.4 overall with 0.2 left or right. I'm not worried about that wind dying off just because of how close it is to where I want it.
Right, and that's something that I've got to train myself too as a shooter. Is you've got the entire target to use. You're holding usually you've got left edge, you're favoring left edge, you're favoring right edge, whatever it is. But you've got the entire target still sitting there. So, and that's all brain games that you've got to treat yourself. Even like you said, if you are within a certain amount, you're still going to hit the target. The biggest issue is like here in Dog Valley where we shoot our match, you've got a 3 mile an hour right to left 1 second, and then all of a sudden it completely changes the other direction, and you can watch bullets. I mean, I've watched, dirt all of a sudden sweep and go the other way, and that's kind of the crazy thing about it. But this is all cool stuff to me, as a hunter and a shooter. Before we leave, I kind of wanted to go over with Emil, as ammunition companies come around, as everybody else comes around, things are changing. I mean, ammunition isn't what it was even 5 years ago. The SDs and everything. You can shoot a lot of factory ammo now. I wanted to go over your guys' your new long-range hybrid target bullets. I wanted to talk about those because they've been, really popular. All your target bullets have been extremely popular. But what's different about the new one?
So we have we got a new engineer down in Berger about a year ago. And the guy really has been a game changer for us. His name is Garrett Stoddard, sharp kid. And so immediately, started looking at, all these issues about, new bullet designs and what makes sense. And we're very fortunate to have Brian Litz as part of our team down there too, to help design the bullets. So one thing that we have always wanted to do is kind of point our bullets in the factory. A lot of people aftermarket closed tips or point Berger bullets anyway, and there's aftermarket dies, bullet pointing dies that people use. We wanted to do it in an industrial way that was consistent. So we developed this process called, they call it MRT or MEPLA reduction technique. So you've got it's applying kind of hydraulic pressure to the nose of the bullet in such a way that these points are very, very consistent, and they're not over pointed. If you over point a bullet, you can actually damage the nose of the bullet and really hurt your performance. So number one, these long range hybrid target bullets have a reduced MEPLA, which is the term for the dimension, the opening of the tip of the bullet. And then the second thing is, we've done a lot of work on our jacket consistency and also on where the lead line is inside these bullets. So lead line is how much lead fills up the bullet. So doing a lot of testing and studying to determine where that lead line is and where optimally it is for each bullet and caliber to get the center of gravity in a place to where that bullet is stable through flight. So in bullets, you have center of gravity and center pressure. On an arrow, center pressure is the fletchings of an arrow. That keeps the back of the arrow, and the center of gravity is up here. So as the arrow is flying through the air, it's stable. It's not flipping end over end. So with bullets, in order to stabilize them, we spin them. So as you spin a bullet, you create a center of pressure. So you want to keep that center of gravity, which is forward on the bullet, and the center of pressure, which is towards the rear of the bullet, in a way that all the way through rotations, they never get to the point where the bullet's not stable anymore and it starts going end over, end over, end over. So these bullets are extremely stable and extremely consistent. So we've been shooting over radar, and these bullets are averaging around 0.5% BC variation, which is insane. So we've got a 6mm 109 grain. We've got a 6.5 millimeter 144 grain. We've got a 190 grain 7 mil, which for these guys that are shooting like 28 nozzlers, 300 Norman neck down to 7 millimeter. It's a fantastic bullet. We've got a 208 and a 220 grain 30 cal bullet, and we're working on some more. And all these bullets, they have very little bearing surface. So if you're shooting a 105 and you want to try the 109, you're probably not going to lose very much, if any, velocity with your same load, because the bearing surface is reduced on all these bullets. So if you're shooting 140 successfully, the 144, all these bullets, it's going to give you about a 7-8% BC increase over our 140. And the 190 is kind of about the same bearing surface as the 184, and the 208 and 220 have similar bearing surfaces to the 215. So they're very high performance bullets. and I really recommend that people try them. They're all up on our website. So we have a free ballistic calculator on our website. It's the same engine that Applied Ballistics uses because Brian wrote it. So all those bullets are up there. You can go to our website, burgerbullets.com, and play around with the free ballistic solver, and you can compare and see wind drift and trajectory and things like that. So we're really excited about these bullets. We released them all before SHOT Show and at SHOT Show, and they're already all in production. So they should be at our normal distributors. Big ones for us are Midway, Brownells, Bruno's, Graf and Sons. That's probably the best place to look for our bullets right away.
Yeah, and just for you listeners, so you kind of understand what he means about bearing surface. So as a bullet comes back, you've got the nose of the me-plat. It comes back to the ogive straight and then back to the boat tail. So your bearing surface is between your ogive and your boat tail. So what he's saying is there's very little bearing spot that touches the barrel between your ogive and the back of the bullet. So by doing that, it creates less friction or less drag going down the barrel.
Exactly.
And that's really good with a lot of different barrel manufacturers when you get into that, because different barrel manufacturers have a lot of different tolerances when it comes to the inside dimensions, whether it's bore or groove, and how they go about when they hand lap and different things like that. And we'll go through that in different episodes. But that being said, that is huge for a lot of you shooters, because as it's doing that, it's creating less cleaning issues. It's creating less fouling, all the different things that have a lot of issues that kind of create issues, if you will. That's awesome, and it means a lot. Now, I know I'm going to get asked this. Hunting bullet, since it's pointed, since your meat plat is pretty much closed, it's not going to have a lot of expansion. Do you guys recommend it in hunting, or is it kind of just mostly all?
These bullets are our target bullet line. So unless we're testing these things, but typically speaking, in ballistic gelatin, the more closed the tip, the less sort of expansion you have. So for hunting applications, I would continue to use our hunting bullets, or even some of our, people use a lot of our OTM match bullets in hunting. When the 130 grain AR hybrid tactical in 6.5 is a fantastic hunting bullet, and the 215, which was selected for the SOCOM advanced sniper rifle, the Berger 215, that is a bullet that has excellent terminal effects as well. So, but yeah, for these long-range hybrid target bullets, we're kind of targeting the PRS shooter, the F-class shooter, the hobbyist, the guy just wants to go out there and push himself and his equipment and just see how far he can hit targets.
That's awesome. And, I'm sure you guys have tested them with jacket consistency and everything else. Do the shooters need to worry about keeping it pretty true to barrel twist, or they're pretty much open, the jacket's going to stay together, no issues?
So they're all thick jackets. We design these bullets so they're survivable in some of the wildcat calibers that guys are shooting now. So the target bullet line has a thick jacket. So if you're going to shoot it out of, if you're shooting a 6.5 SOM or 6.5 PRC, you want to send these things at 33, 3,400 feet per second. Shoot one of our target bullets. The hunting bullets, they have a regular jacket on them. It's actually the old Berger VLD jacket, but the target bullets do have a thick jacket. They're meant to be survivable.
Okay, good. Is there anything else you want to add, JD?
No, not really. We can talk about twist rates later on. I'm all about that.
Yeah, that opens up a whole other can of worms, as we've seen, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, I've spent thousands of hours in ballistics labs testing a lot of things, and it's amazing. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I want to start this podcast, is kind of tell people what I found and tell everybody else, what they've found, and kind of hopefully educate people towards more, instead of just buying something because it looks cool, they want to buy it because they understand what it is. So I appreciate you coming on, Emil. I'm sure I'm going to have you back on here in the near future, because I really want to talk more about understanding powders and different things when it comes to, that. I mean, we can get into a whole episode on the SK line because everybody's getting into NRL 22 and 22 competitions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we can cover here. I appreciate both of you guys taking your time. It's about an hour and a half. It takes a lot of time, but hopefully all of our listeners got something out of it. Is there anything you want to add in closing, Emil?
I really appreciate the opportunity here, Cole, and to let me talk a little bit about stuff that we're doing on the capstone side, and just kind of let me ramble, let an old graybeard kind of just, reminisce a little bit. So I really do appreciate time. And JD, is great seeing you again. And if you're still in North Kakalaki, I'll probably see you in March.
Yeah, sounds good. Looking forward to seeing you too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cole. Yeah, for everyone who's watching, the biggest thing we see is guys wanting to jump too fast into the cool side of ballistics, which it's just super nerdy. That's all it is. So as long as you focus on basics are 95% of the game. Once you get those basics down and perfect them, that's where you see those improvements. It's those steady, small improvements that you don't notice over a week or a month, but 6 months down the road, you look back on it, and all those little small gains are what gets you to be the good shooter you are there. None of the fancy stuff that we have. Technology, like a few people have talked about, has far outpaced kind of shooters' abilities. So if you focus on those basics, you can use that technology much more effectively than just, say, dropping $10,000 on a setup or something like that.
Very well said.
Yeah, it's all the race to the best thing. And again, I've said it before in the podcast, take your time, become better, become more proficient at what you're doing, spend the time at the range. And I guarantee you're going to be a lot better shooter when it comes down to it. That's all there is. And I appreciate everybody for listening. It's going to be a wild ride. So hopefully you guys can subscribe to the podcast. We'll have both of these guys back on here pretty soon. Again, thank you to Benchmark Barrels for thinking of us. We appreciate their support. Go follow us, Facebook. We're on YouTube, and then the Firearms Radio Network. Again, thanks, and I hope you have all a good night.
Okay. Thanks, Cole. Have a good night.
I don't know what to do with my hands.